I had the vial hidden inside my sleeve for 6 hours before I finally understood I was never going to use it on him, and by the time I made that decision, it was already far too late to choose anything except which one of us the poison was going to take. My name was Rhys Calloway, and I had spent 4 months working inside the Drake household as a quiet, unremarkable companion to Cassian Drake's elderly aunt, a position that required nothing more demanding of me than reading aloud in the evenings and pouring tea with steady hands. It was, by any reasonable measure, the safest work I had done in years. It became, on one particular night in early spring, the most dangerous thing I had ever attempted, because a rival family called Marchetti had found the one lever in my life capable of turning me into a weapon, and they had not hesitated to pull it. I had taken the position through an employment agency that specialized in placing quiet, discreet staff within ranked families' households, a business built on precisely the kind of careful vetting that should have made an operation like the one about to unfold nearly impossible. I had wanted, when I applied, nothing more complicated than steady income and a household distant enough from my old neighborhood that no lingering association with my father's debts might follow me into it. I had never once imagined, filling out that application, that the very household I chose for its supposed distance from danger would eventually become the place where danger found me most precisely. My younger sister, Elawan, was 14 years old, still finishing her schooling in a modest house 3 towns from the Drake estate, entirely unconnected to the criminal world our family had accidentally brushed against years earlier when our father's small logistics business had been swallowed whole by the Marchetti organization's expansion. She knew nothing about Mafia territory disputes or blood debts or the particular currency of fear that ran underneath every transaction in that world. She only knew that she went to sleep one Tuesday night in her own bed and woke the next morning in a locked room 3 counties away, with a phone pressed into her hands and a stranger's voice on the other end instructing her to say exactly 4 sentences to me and nothing more. "I need you to listen carefully," she'd said, her voice thin and terrified in a way that had nothing rehearsed left in it by the second sentence. "They said if I don't say this exactly right, something bad happens. They said you have 3 days to put something in Cassian Drake's wine or I don't come home." Our father had died 3 years earlier, not from any direct violence, but from the slow, grinding weight of a debt he could never fully outrun. His small logistics business absorbed piece by piece into the Marchetti organization's territory until nothing remained of what he'd built except the obligation attached to its remains. He had kept that obligation from Elawan and me for as long as he could manage, working himself into an early grave, trying to satisfy demands that only ever grew heavier the longer he attempted to meet them, until his heart simply gave out one winter morning at his desk, 3 ledgers open in front of him, and a debt still very much unpaid. The Marchetti family had considered the matter settled after that, or at least dormant, one more small business quietly consumed and forgotten among 100 others. I had spent 3 years believing we were finally, genuinely free of it, careful enough and unremarkable enough that whatever remained of our father's obligation had simply died along with him. I understood, standing in my small, rented room with that terrified phone call still ringing in my ears, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. The Marchetti family did not forget debts. They simply waited, patient and calculating, for the moment a remaining piece of that old obligation became useful again, and my quiet position inside the Drake household, entirely coincidental and unconnected to any deliberate plan on my part, had apparently presented exactly that opportunity the moment someone inside their organization identified it. I had not slept properly since that call. I had spent 3 days performing the same quiet, unremarkable competence I always performed, reading to Cassian's aunt in the evenings, refilling water glasses, moving through the Drake household as the kind of person nobody paused to examine closely, while inside my chest, a single countdown ran louder than anything else in my life had ever run before. The vial itself had arrived by courier the following morning, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address, accompanied by a single unsigned note. Odorless, painless, 15 minutes. Your sister comes home the moment it's done. I had turned that vial over in my hands more times than I could count in 3 days, weighing every possible alternative against the single unbearable fact that I had absolutely no way to verify whether Alowan was even still alive, no way to negotiate, no way to call for help without risking whatever fragile promise stood between my sister and whatever the Marchetti family actually intended for her if I failed. I had considered going to Cassian directly, throwing myself on whatever mercy a Mafia boss I barely knew might be capable of extending to a stranger's terrified sibling. I had considered running, taking what little money I had, and disappearing before the deadline arrived, though some instinct warned me that running would only guarantee the worst outcome for Alowan rather than prevent it. In the end, I did neither of those things, because on the third evening, standing in the Drake Estate's private dining room with a decanter of wine in one hand and a vial of poison hidden in my sleeve, watching Cassian Drake laugh quietly at something his aunt had said, entirely unaware that death was standing 3 feet away from him in the shape of a companion he barely noticed, I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that I could not do it. Not because I doubted the Marchetti family's willingness to follow through on their threat, because somewhere in 4 months of quiet, unremarkable proximity to this man, I had come to know the particular gentleness underneath his reputation, the way he always thanked the staff by name, the way he sat with his aunt every single evening despite an empire's worth of more urgent business waiting elsewhere, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something genuinely amused him rather than merely required a diplomatic smile. I could not turn all of that into a body on the dining room floor, whatever it cost my sister for my failure. I thought, standing there with the decanter growing heavier in my hand with every passing second, of the first evening I had actually noticed him properly, some 6 weeks into my employment, when he had found me crying quietly in the estate's library over a letter from home that had nothing to do with him at all, and rather than simply passing by the way most employers would have, he had sat down across from me, said nothing demanding, and simply waited until I was ready to either speak or not, entirely on my own terms. I thought of the particular patience he brought to every conversation with his aunt, whose memory had begun failing in small, painful ways over the past year, never once showing the smallest flicker of impatience, however many times she repeated the same story within a single evening. I thought of 100 small, unremarkable kindnesses I had cataloged without meaning to over 4 months of quiet observation, and understood that whatever the Marchetti family believed they had purchased with my sister's freedom, they had badly miscalculated exactly what kind of person they were asking me to betray. So when the moment finally arrived, when Cassian's aunt excused herself for the evening and left the two of us alone with the wine I was meant to have already poisoned, I made a decision that had nothing rational left inside it at all. I poured 2 glasses instead of 1. I emptied the vial into mine. Cassian noticed something wrong almost immediately, though I would learn later it wasn't the poison itself that alerted him, not at first, but the particular unsteadiness in my hands as I lifted the glass, a tremor I hadn't managed to fully control despite 3 days of careful rehearsal. "You look unwell," he said, setting down his own glass without drinking from it. "Rhys, is something wrong?" "I'm only tired," I told him, and lifted the poisoned glass to my mouth before he could ask anything further, before my own resolve could crack under the weight of what I was actually about to do to myself. I don't fully remember the next several minutes with any clarity. I remember the wine tasting exactly as ordinary as it always did, no bitter edge, no warning at all, exactly as the note had promised. I remember Cassian's voice sharpening with concern as my hand went unsteady around the glass's stem. I remember the room tilting sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the modest amount of wine I'd actually consumed, and I remember, with sudden sickening clarity, understanding that the 15 minutes the note had promised were not going to be gentle at all. My vision narrowed first, the warm lamplight of the dining room contracting into something distant and swimming, sounds arriving muffled and delayed as though I'd suddenly been submerged in water considerably deeper than the room itself could account for. My limbs stopped answering with any reliability, the glass slipping from fingers that no longer seemed to belong to me, shattering somewhere against the floor in a sound that reached me strange and hollow, as if it were happening to someone else in a room adjacent to my own collapsing world. "Rhys," Cassian said again, and this time his voice carried an urgency I had never once heard from him in 4 months of quiet observation. He was already moving toward me, catching me as my knees buckled, lowering me carefully to the floor while his other hand fumbled for the security phone. Every room in that estate kept mounted discreetly near the door. "Someone get the physician. Now." "I want to tell you it wasn't poison," I managed, the words coming out slurred and strange even to my own ears. "The wine. It was meant for you. I couldn't. I'm sorry. I couldn't do it to you. So I did it to myself instead." Something shifted in his expression, horror giving way, briefly, to a confusion so total it seemed to freeze him in place for a fraction of a second longer than the emergency should have allowed. Then he was moving again, faster, shouting orders down the hallway with a command in his voice that brought half the household staff running within seconds. The physician arrived in what felt from inside the strange, narrowing tunnel of my own consciousness, like both an eternity and no time at all. I remember hands checking my pulse, someone forcing something bitter and immediate down my throat that I would later learn was a general emetic administered on the theory that expelling whatever I'd consumed gave the physician the best chance of identifying and countering it before the 15-minute window the note had promised closed entirely. I remember Cassian's hand gripping mine throughout the entire ordeal, his voice a low, steady anchor against the panic clawing up through my chest, telling me to stay with him, to keep my eyes open, to not you dare leave this conversation unfinished. I don't remember losing consciousness. I only remember, much later, waking in an unfamiliar bed in a room considerably finer than any I had occupied in the Drake household before, with Cassian asleep in a chair pulled close beside it, his hand still loosely curled around mine, as though he hadn't let go once in whatever hours had passed. "You're awake," he said the instant my eyes opened, coming fully alert with a speed that suggested he hadn't actually been sleeping deeply at all. "How do you feel?" "Alive," I managed, my voice raw and unfamiliar. "Which I understand I have you to thank for." Something moved across his face, complicated and unreadable in a way I hadn't yet learned to interpret in 4 months of careful, distant observation. "The physician says another 10 minutes without treatment would have been fatal," he said. "You are going to explain to me, calmly and completely, exactly what happened tonight and why, and I would ask that you not leave out a single detail, however much you believe it might implicate you." I told him everything then, my voice cracking at several points as 3 days of carefully suppressed terror finally found somewhere safe enough to break. I told him about Aloan, about the phone call, about the vial that had arrived by unmarked courier with its impossible ultimatum. I told him about the 3 days I'd spent turning every alternative over in my mind and finding none of them survivable, and about the exact moment in that dining room when I had understood with total clarity that I would rather die myself than become the instrument of his death. Cassian was silent for a long moment after I finished, his jaw working with a barely contained fury that I understood, even in my exhausted state, was not directed at me. "The Marchetti family," he said finally, his voice gone dangerously quiet. "They didn't simply threaten your sister to force your hand. They specifically targeted someone in my own household, someone close enough to me to have unsupervised access to my private dining room, which means they had inside knowledge of my household staffing that no outside family should have been able to acquire without help. The realization landed between us with the particular cold weight of a threat that had suddenly widened considerably beyond the immediate crisis of the poisoned wine. "Someone inside this house told them about me," I said slowly. the pieces settling into place even through the lingering fog of whatever the physician had administered. Someone helped them identify exactly which member of your staff would be the easiest to compromise. Yes, Cassian said, and I intend to find out who before another attempt succeeds where tonight's failed. I want to help find my sister, I said, pushing myself upright despite the wave of dizziness the movement produced. Whatever you're planning, whatever resources this requires, I need to be part of it. She's still out there, Cassian. Every hour we spend investigating who helped the Marchetti family is an hour she spends locked in a room with no idea whether I'm even alive to come for her. He studied me for a long moment, something in his expression shifting from the controlled fury of a moment before into something gentler, more careful. You nearly died tonight protecting me from a threat I didn't even know existed, he said. I am not going to ask you to sit quietly on the sidelines while I handle the consequences of that sacrifice alone. But you will let my people work alongside you, not instead of you. I have resources for exactly this kind of situation that a single person, however determined, simply doesn't have access to. I nodded, too exhausted and too grateful for the offer to argue the particulars, and it was only much later, replaying that conversation in the quiet hours before dawn, that I understood how significant a concession he had actually made. A man in Cassian Drake's position, I would learn over the following weeks, rarely extended that kind of partnership to anyone, let alone a household companion who had, by his own admission, come within minutes of dying under his own roof from a threat aimed originally at him. The physician confined me to bed rest for the following full day, a restriction I fought against with a restlessness that clearly tested even Cassian's considerable patience. Though he never once raised his voice about it, he simply moved his own work into the room where I was recovering, bringing in a second desk so he could handle the mounting operational demands of the investigation while remaining within arm's reach of the bed, an arrangement that struck me, once I was clear-headed enough to properly notice it, as considerably more intimate than anything a man in his position should have reasonably extended to household staff. You don't have to stay in here working, I told him at one point, watching him frown over a document that had clearly been troubling him for the better part of an hour. I'm not going to disappear if you step out to handle things properly. I'm aware of that, he said, without looking up. I would simply rather not risk it. He glanced up then, catching whatever expression had crossed my face at that admission, and something in his own expression softened slightly. You nearly died in front of me 2 nights ago, Rhys. I find I'm not particularly interested in being anywhere else until I'm considerably more confident that isn't about to happen again. I didn't have a ready response for that kind of honesty, not from a man I had, until 3 days earlier, considered essentially a stranger I happened to serve tea to each evening. I let the silence settle instead, watching him work, and found somewhere in that quiet hour the first genuine calm I'd experienced since Elowen's terrified voice had first come through that phone. It was during that same recovery day that he told me, unprompted, why the sight of me collapsing over a poisoned glass had struck him with a force considerably beyond ordinary shock. My father died the same way, he said, not looking up from the document in front of him, his voice carefully even in a way that told me the evenness itself was costing him something. Poison. At a dinner very much like the one you and I shared 3 nights ago, delivered by someone inside our own household who had been compromised by a rival family in exactly the manner Marisol appears to have been compromised. I was 19. I watched it happen and had no idea in the moment what I was actually witnessing until it was already far too late to do anything except watch him die in front of me. I hadn't known that, I said quietly. I'm sorry. It's not a story I share often, he admitted. I built this entire household security apparatus, in part, around making certain it never happened again. And then 3 nights ago, I sat across a dining table and watched it happen anyway, except this time it was you rather than my father. And I discovered, in the middle of that particular horror, that I had absolutely no framework prepared for how much worse it felt the second time, Watching someone I had only just begun to properly notice nearly die in exactly the same manner I'd spent years guarding against. I understood, hearing that, considerably more about the fierce, immediate protectiveness he had shown from the very first moment of the crisis, a reaction that had seemed, even through the fog of the poison itself, disproportionate to 4 months of largely unremarkable acquaintance between us. It wasn't disproportionate at all, I realized. It was a wound reopening in real time, and he had managed, even through that reopening, to hold himself together well enough to save my life. The investigation into who had betrayed the Drake household's confidence moved with a speed that made clear exactly how seriously Cassian took the breach. Within 2 days, his head of security, a sharp, methodical woman named Priya who had served the family for over a decade, presented findings that turned my stomach in an entirely new direction. It was Marisol, she said, naming the head housekeeper who had overseen my own hiring 4 months earlier, the woman who had trained me in the particular rhythms of the estate, who had seemed, in every interaction I could recall, genuinely kind. She's been feeding information to a Marchetti contact for the better part of a year. Staff schedules, household access patterns, personal details about anyone new brought into close proximity with the family. We found the payment trail this morning. Why? Cassian asked, his voice flat with barely restrained anger. Priya's expression tightened. Her brother owes considerable gambling debts to a Marchetti-controlled operation. She's been paying them off with information rather than money for over a year, apparently believing the arrangement would eventually satisfy the debt entirely. It hasn't. If anything, the demands have only grown more specific in recent months, which suggests they were building toward exactly the kind of operation attempted 3 nights ago. Bring her to me, Cassian said, and find out everything she knows about where they're holding Rhys's sister. I don't particularly care what leverage that requires. Before Marisol was brought in, Cassian addressed the wider household staff himself, gathering everyone from the kitchen workers to the groundskeepers into the estate's main hall, with an announcement that visibly unsettled the entire room. Someone within this household provided information that led directly to an attempt on a member of this family's life, he told them, his voice carrying the particular controlled authority that made every person in that hall stand a little straighter. I do not yet know the full extent of what was compromised, which means every routine, every access protocol, every assumption this household has operated under is being reviewed effective immediately. I would ask that anyone with information relevant to this investigation come forward now, voluntarily, because the difference between voluntary disclosure and information I extract through my own investigation is considerably more significant than most of you currently understand. I watched the staff's faces during that announcement, cataloging the particular fear that moved through the room, and found myself, even in the midst of my own exhaustion and lingering nausea from the poison's after effects, feeling a strange, unexpected sympathy for a household suddenly forced to reckon with a betrayal none of them had seen coming any more clearly than I had. Most of them, I understood even then, were entirely innocent, caught in the wider net of suspicion simply by proximity to whoever had actually been compromised. No one came forward voluntarily that evening. It was Priya's own investigative work, painstaking and methodical, that identified Marisol within 2 days regardless, though I would learn later that the housekeeper's collapse under questioning, once confronted with the evidence, had come considerably faster than either Priya or Cassian had actually expected. The weight of a year's accumulated guilt finally finding somewhere it could no longer be contained. Marisol, when she was brought before us in Cassian's private study, looked considerably older than the woman who had welcomed me to the estate 4 months earlier, the careful composure she'd maintained through a year of quiet betrayal finally cracking under the weight of consequences she had clearly hoped, against all reason, to avoid indefinitely. I found myself watching her stand there, unable to summon the particular fury I might have expected from myself. She had trained me my very first week, patient and unhurried in a way that had made the strange, dislocating transition into that household considerably easier than it might otherwise have been, and some part of me, even knowing what she had done, still remembered that patience clearly enough to complicate the anger I felt entitled to. I never wanted anyone to get hurt, she said, her voice unsteady. I only ever gave them scheduling information. I didn't know what they intended to do with it. You gave them precisely the information required to identify the newest, most vulnerable member of this household and manufacture a threat sophisticated enough to compromise him completely, Cassian said, his voice carrying none of the warmth I had come to associate with him over 4 months of quiet observation. A 14-year-old girl is currently locked somewhere I have not yet located because of information you provided. I would suggest you begin explaining everything you know in considerable detail if you have any interest in this conversation ending better than it currently appears likely to. She was in the room, I said quietly, and both of them turned to look at me, surprised, I think, that I had chosen to speak at all. The night it happened. She served the wine alongside me. She stood 3 feet away while I nearly died and she said nothing. Marisol flinched at that, her composure cracking properly for the first time. I didn't know that was the night, she said. I swear to you, I didn't know they'd chosen that evening specifically. If I had known, I would have found some way to warn you, whatever it cost my brother. I don't believe that excuses anything, I told her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. But I understand better than most people in this house probably could exactly what kind of fear makes a person choose silence over the alternative. I only wish you'd found a different alternative before it came to this. Marisol's information, once she began speaking, painted a considerably more detailed picture than Priya's initial investigation had managed to surface alone. The Marchetti contact she'd been reporting to for over a year was a mid-level enforcer named Dante Cortez, who operated out of a warehouse complex on the territory's eastern edge, an area technically claimed by neither the Drake nor Marchetti organizations directly, kept deliberately neutral for exactly this kind of off-book operation. I gave him the schedule for the household staff 3 months ago, Marisol said. I didn't know they'd use it to target someone specific until after the fact. When I realized what had happened to the new companion, I should have said something. I was afraid of what they'd do to my brother if they learned I'd cooperated with an investigation. Your brother's debts are the least significant casualty in this situation, Cassian said. Where exactly is this warehouse complex? The information Marisol provided, combined with Priya's own surveillance resources, narrowed the search considerably over the following 6 hours. Though I spent every minute of that search fighting down a fear that threatened to become entirely paralyzing every time I let myself imagine what 3 additional days of captivity might have already done to my sister. Cassian did not leave my side through any of it, coordinating the operation from his study with a focus that made clear exactly how seriously he was treating a threat that had, technically, only ever been aimed at him by proxy. We move at dusk, he said finally, once Priya's surveillance had confirmed activity consistent with a small holding operation inside the warehouse complex's northern building. I want you with the secondary team, close enough to be there the moment she's secured, but not on the initial breach. I understand you have every reason to want to lead that breach yourself. I am asking you to trust my people to handle it properly, because a rescue operation succeeds through discipline, not through the desperate urgency of someone who loves the person being rescued. I hated the request, even as I understood the sense in it. I agreed anyway because 4 months of quiet observation had taught me that Cassian Drake did not make requests like that without genuine reason behind them, and because some exhausted, frightened part of me recognized that my own desperate urgency was exactly the liability he was trying to protect Elowen from becoming a casualty of. The hours between that decision and dusk stretched longer than any wait I had ever endured. Longer even than the 3 days of the original deadline, because at least those 3 days had come with tasks to occupy my hands, meals to prepare, water glasses to refill, the small mechanical rituals of my ordinary work keeping the worst of the terror at some manageable distance. There was nothing to occupy the wait for dusk beyond the wait itself, and I spent most of it pacing the length of Cassian's study while Priya's team finalized their approach and Cassian himself worked through contingency after contingency with a methodical calm that I understood, watching him, was its own kind of discipline rather than any genuine absence of fear. "You're allowed to be afraid," I told him at one point, surprising myself with the observation. "You don't have to perform calm for my benefit." He looked up from the maps spread across his desk, something flickering behind his composed expression before he answered. "I am afraid," he admitted. I have run operations considerably more dangerous than this one without feeling anything close to what I'm feeling right now. Watching the clock move toward an hour that determines whether a 14-year-old girl comes home safely or doesn't. I find that particular fear considerably harder to manage than any I've encountered in this line of work before, and I don't fully understand yet why this operation, specifically, has gotten so far under whatever composure I usually rely on. I understood exactly why, even if he hadn't yet found the language for it himself, though I said nothing, some instinct warning me that naming it too soon in the middle of an operation this fragile might do more harm than good to both of us. The breach itself, when it came, moved with a speed and precision that left me standing at the edge of the warehouse complex's perimeter, with my heart in my throat, watching Cassian's security team disappear into the northern building's shadows with a coordinated silence that suggested considerable practice at exactly this kind of operation. I counted the minutes in a way that felt physically painful, every second stretching longer than the last. The radio silence between Priya's initial confirmation of breach and her next transmission somehow managing to feel both instant and unbearably endless at once, until her voice finally crackled through the radio Cassian held pressed against his ear. Target secured. One hostile down, non-lethal. Girl is alive, frightened, but unharmed. Something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 3 straight days finally released all at once, so completely that my knees genuinely buckled, and it was only Cassian's arm catching me, steady and immediate, that kept me upright long enough to watch the security team emerge from the building's shadows with Elowen between them, wrapped in someone's jacket. Her face streaked with tears, but her steps steady enough that I understood, even from a distance, that whatever 3 days of captivity had cost her, it had not broken her entirely. She saw me before I fully registered moving toward her, and the sound she made crossing that remaining distance between us was not quite a word at all, just a raw, wordless cry of relief that matched exactly the one building in my own throat. I caught her as she reached me, both of us sinking to our knees in the gravel outside that warehouse, and for a long moment neither of us managed anything beyond simply holding on, 3 days of terror finally finding somewhere safe enough to break completely. "I knew you'd come," she whispered into my shoulder, once she'd finally found her voice again. "I told them you would." "I nearly didn't make it in time," I admitted, my own voice cracking on the confession. "I did something very foolish trying to protect someone instead of you, and it very nearly cost both of us everything." It was some days later, once she'd settled enough into the safety of the estate to talk about it at all, that Elowen told me the fuller shape of those 3 days, sitting curled against my side in the small garden the Drake household kept for its private wing, while I struggled not to let my own reaction to what she was describing frighten her further. They hadn't hurt her, not physically. A mercy I understood even then had been calculated rather than kind. Some cold Marchetti logic about the value of an unharmed hostage over a damaged one. But they had kept the room dark most hours, played recordings of my own voice from old messages to unsettle her, told her repeatedly that I had already failed to save her and simply hadn't been informed yet. "I spent the whole time telling myself you'd never actually let me down," she said. "Even when they kept saying you had. I would never let you down," I told her, though even as I said it, I understood how thin a promise it had actually come within hours of breaking, and some part of me ached at how close 3 days and one desperate decision had come to making a liar out of me entirely. Cassian, standing a few careful steps back to give us that first reunion its necessary privacy, met my eyes over the top of Elowen's head, and something passed between us in that look that I had no ready framework for interpreting yet. Not gratitude exactly, though there was gratitude in it, something closer to a recognition that had been building, quiet and unacknowledged, across 4 months of careful proximity long before either of us had understood what it actually meant. Dante Cortez, the enforcer who had been holding Alawan, was taken into custody during the raid, and the information he provided under Priya's considerably more patient questioning confirmed what both Cassian and I had already begun to suspect. I was present for part of that questioning myself, standing quietly at the back of the room while Priya worked through Cortez's carefully constructed evasions with a patience that felt, to me, considerably more unsettling than outright violence would have been. Cortez, for his part, seemed to understand quickly enough that patience was its own kind of pressure, and his composure began cracking within the first hour. though it took considerably longer than that before he offered anything approaching the full picture. "We were never told to actually kill him," Cortez said at one point, gesturing vaguely in a direction that I understood was meant to indicate Cassian, wherever he happened to be in the estate at that moment. The instructions were clear about that. Compromise the household, prove we could reach inside it, use the girl as insurance in case the companion lost his nerve. Nobody anticipated the companion drinking the wine himself. That wasn't in anyone's planning. The poisoned wine had never actually been intended primarily as an assassination attempt at all, not in its most immediate purpose. The Marchetti family had understood correctly that killing Cassian Drake outright would trigger a retaliation from his organization severe enough to threaten their entire territory. What they had actually wanted was considerably more calculated. They had wanted proof, verifiable and undeniable, that they possessed the capability to compromise the Drake household from the inside, a demonstration meant to be leveraged in ongoing territorial negotiations rather than executed to its full lethal conclusion. "They never expected you to drink it yourself," Cassian said, once Cortez's full confession had been laid out before us in Priya's careful written summary. "Their entire plan assumed you would either succeed in poisoning me or fail and be caught in the attempt, either outcome giving them exactly the leverage they wanted. They never once accounted for the possibility that you would choose to take the poison yourself rather than deliver it to its intended target. I didn't plan it as a strategy," I admitted. "I only knew, standing in that room, that I could not do it to you, and there was no version of the evening remaining where I walked away without something happening to one of us." Something moved across his face at that admission, quick and unguarded in a way I had learned. Over the previous week, he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "You could have run," he said. "You could have taken your sister's warning and simply disappeared before the deadline, accepted whatever consequence that brought, and put both of us out of the equation entirely." "I considered it," I admitted. "I told myself running would only guarantee the worst outcome, and that was true. But it wasn't the only reason I didn't run. I think some part of me had already decided well before that final evening that I didn't want to disappear from a household where I had actually started, against every careful instinct I'd built over years of staying invisible, to feel like I mattered to someone." The weeks that followed unfolded slower and more carefully than the crisis that had preceded them, both of us navigating a shift in the relationship between us that neither had fully articulated yet, but both clearly understood had already happened. Cassian moved Elowen and me out of the household staff's separate quarters entirely, installing us instead in a private wing of the estate with a security detail that made unmistakably clear exactly how seriously he now regarded our safety, a decision that drew no small amount of quiet commentary from the rest of the household, none of which either of us particularly cared to acknowledge. Elowen adjusted to her new circumstances with the particular resilience of a 14-year-old who had already survived the worst of what the situation had to offer, and now simply wanted, more than anything, ordinary stability. She grew fond of Cassian's aunt within days, spending long afternoons in the same reading sessions I had once conducted professionally, now transformed into something closer to genuine family gathering. And I watched with a quiet, disbelieving wonder an entire household reshape itself around the two of us in ways that had nothing left of the careful invisibility I had spent years cultivating as my primary form of survival. Cassian and I found our own rhythm in those same weeks, slower and more deliberate than either of us might have expected, given how the crisis that introduced us had unfolded. He began seeking me out in the evenings once his aunt and Elowen had both retired, not with any particular agenda beyond conversation, and I found myself, for the first time in years, genuinely looking forward to those quiet hours rather than simply enduring them out of professional obligation. There was an evening, perhaps 3 weeks after Elowen's rescue, when he asked me directly whether the poison had frightened me the way it should have, in the moment I'd chosen to drink it. I didn't let myself feel the fear until afterward, I admitted. In the moment itself, there wasn't room for it. There was only the certainty that I couldn't let it happen to you, and everything else got pushed aside to make room for that single decision. That kind of certainty terrifies me, he said quietly. Not because I doubt it, because I understand exactly how easily it could have gone the other direction, and I am only now beginning to understand how much I would have lost if it had. I reached for his hand then, the first time I had deliberately closed that particular distance between us rather than simply accepting it when he offered it, and felt him go still with a surprise that told me, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how carefully he had been pacing himself around whatever he suspected I might not yet be ready for. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. "Whatever this is becoming between us, I would like the chance to actually find out, properly, rather than letting fear about what nearly happened keep either of us from it." The formal reckoning with the Marchetti family arrived nearly a month after Elowen's rescue, delivered not through violence, but through a carefully documented dossier Cassian presented to the territory's assembled ranked families, laying out in exhaustive, undeniable detail the full scope of the operation. Marisol's compromised loyalty, Cortez's captivity of a minor, and the calculated, bloodless demonstration the Marchetti family had attempted to extract at the cost of an innocent teenager's freedom, and very nearly my own life. "You endangered a child to manufacture leverage in a territorial dispute," Cassian said to the assembled families, his voice carrying the particular cold authority I had by then come to recognize as his most dangerous register. My household nearly lost a member of its own family as a direct result of that calculation. I would like every family in this room to understand precisely what continued association with the Marchetti organization now costs, and to make their own determinations accordingly about whether that association remains worth maintaining. The Marchetti patriarch, a narrow, coldly composed man named Ezra, who had built his family's reputation on precisely the kind of calculated, deniable operations Cortez's capture had now exposed, attempted a defense that fooled no one in that hall, least of all the families he was addressing. "The girl was never in genuine danger," he said. "My people were instructed to keep her comfortable throughout the arrangement, purely as leverage, nothing more." Priya's written summary, distributed to every family present before the assembly began, contradicted that claim in exhaustive, documented detail, down to the recordings Cortez's own people had used to convince a 14-year-old that her brother had already abandoned her. "Comfortable," Cassian repeated, letting the words sit in the silence that followed with all the weight its obvious falseness deserved. I would invite anyone in this room who genuinely believes that account to speak with the girl herself about her 3 days of captivity. I suspect her description would differ considerably from yours. No one in that hall offered to take him up on the invitation. The Marchetti patriarch's isolation following that assembly was swift and, by every account that reached me afterward, nearly total, 3 allied families formally severing ties within the week, unwilling to be associated any longer with an organization willing to target children to win a territorial argument. I did not attend the assembly myself, choosing instead to spend that particular evening with Elowen in the private wing small garden. The two of us finally, properly safe enough to simply exist together without the constant vigilance 3 days of captivity and 1 poisoned glass of wine had demanded of us both. Cassian found me there afterward, once the assembly had concluded, settling onto the garden bench beside me with the particular careful deliberateness that had become, over the preceding month, his usual way of asking permission before closing any distance between us. "It's finished," he said. "The Marchetti family will not attempt anything against this household again, not for a very long time." "Good," I said, and meant it entirely, though some part of me understood the sentence carried considerably less weight than the quieter, more personal question sitting underneath it, the one neither of us had yet found the right moment to properly address. "I want to ask you something," Cassian said, and I heard, for the first time since I had known him, a genuine uncertainty in his voice that had nothing to do with territorial politics or security operations. "You came into this household as a companion for my aunt, and I confess I barely noticed you at all for the first several months, which I understand now was a genuine failure of attention on my part, given everything that followed. I would like to ask whether you would consider staying, not in that same capacity, but as something considerably more significant to me, if that's something you might want as well." I turned to look at him properly, searching his face for whatever careful calculation I had spent years learning to detect in the people around me, and finding, instead, only an honest, unguarded hope that matched, almost exactly, the same fragile hope building quietly in my own chest. "I drank poison meant for you rather than let anything happen to you," I told him. I think that answer was decided before either of us found the language to properly ask the question. The bonding mark he gave me some weeks later carried nothing of the clinical formality I had once assumed such rituals required. It happened on an ordinary evening, no assembled families watching, no political necessity demanding it, only the quiet, deliberate choice of two people who had nearly lost each other to a threat neither had seen coming, choosing instead to move toward each other with open eyes and full understanding of exactly what that choice meant. Alowen insisted, when she learned what had happened, on marking the occasion in her own way, presenting us the following morning with a small, carefully wrapped gift that turned out to be two matching glasses, plain and unremarkable, nothing like the fine crystal the estate's formal dining room kept for entertaining. "So you both have something to drink from that isn't dangerous," she said, half joking and half entirely serious in the particular way only a 14-year-old who had nearly lost everything could manage, and I found myself laughing and crying in nearly the same breath, holding both glasses like they were considerably more precious than their plain, ordinary make actually warranted. We use them still, most evenings, a small private ritual neither of us has ever needed to explain to the other. Cassian pours always a habit he developed without either of us discussing it directly, and I understood, the first time I noticed the pattern, that it was his own quiet way of reclaiming something the Marchetti family had once tried to poison between us. A simple act of trust rebuilt one ordinary evening at a time. Alowen still lives with us in the Drake Estate's private wing, finishing her schooling now under considerably safer circumstances than the ones that had nearly cost her everything. And some evenings, watching her laugh over dinner with Cassian's aunt, entirely unburdened by the fear that had once defined every hour of her captivity, I find myself remembering the particular clarity of that evening in the dining room, the vial hidden in my sleeve, the decision that had felt, in the moment, like the only choice left available to me. I did not know then that choosing to protect him would eventually become the choice that saved us all. I only knew, standing there with the poisoned glass in my hand, that some things mattered more than my own survival, and that I would rather have paid that price myself than let it fall on someone I had already, quietly and without permission, come to love.